In the early days of Christianity, there was a lot of activity, intellectually, theologically, and in the world of literature. Many of these early texts are widely known and popular, and we have already explored some of them here on the channel, but others have a different fate, ending up in the more obscure corners of history, remaining unknown to at least most people. Whether that is because it was texts that were rejected from scriptural canon, or that were discarded for not conforming to the developing orthodoxy, for example. And there's one text from this early period that is one of the most evocative and amazing mystical works perhaps ever written, at least certainly within Christianity, but which remains basically entirely unknown, at least outside of the world of Syriac Christianity and mysticism. This is the text usually referred to as the Book of the Holy Hierotheos. It is a profoundly powerful work of mysticism describing the ascent of the mind to God, a monistic, some have even called it pantheistic, view of the world, and controversially touches on topics like apokatastasis, universal salvation, and radical interpretations of biblical scriptures. So join me as we take a look at what is, at least in my opinion, one of the most fascinating books from late antiquity. So what is the Book of the Holy Hierotheos? Well, the material history of this text and its authorship is basically as mysterious as the contents of the text itself, and there is very little that we can say with complete certainty. It is a text that only exists and seems to have been originally written in Syriac, the dialect of Aramaic used by Christian writers of the Middle East in late antiquity and forward. This was the dialect of Aramaic that existed primarily in what came from the city of Edessa in the wider Syria. Right? Today it's actually part of Turkey, but this is the dialect of Aramaic that was spoken there, and the script and literature that developed there is what it became known, or at least became the origins of what we call Syriac language. The text itself claims to have been originally written in Greek, only later translated into Syriac, but scholars who studied the text seem to agree basically unanimously that this is most likely not the case, since the text uses biblical references and its language in a way that only really makes sense if it was originally a Syriac text. So why would it want to lie about such a thing? It seems like a strange thing to do, to just claim that it was written in Greek when it was actually written in Syriac. Like, why would you do this? This is because there is a level of mystery and pseudonymy in the authorship of the text. You see, the text is claimed, in the text itself, to be written by a figure called Hierotheos. Now, those that have watched this channel, especially the last few episodes on this channel, will perhaps recognize this name. This will be familiar to you, and you are correct about that, and this is an important aspect of this whole story. Hierotheos is claimed to have been a figure who lived in the 1st century and was one of the earliest converts to Christianity when Paul came to Athens. So he was an Athenian who converted to Christianity when Paul came there. In fact, he refers to in the text, he refers to the great teacher, that is Paul, and references Paul a lot as if Paul was the author's actual teacher in life, right? So the authorship of this book claims to be this 1st century early Christian figure. Now, we don't know much about this figure. Really, the only place, or at least one of the very few places as far as I know, that Hierotheos is actually mentioned is in the writings of another very significant early Christian writer, which is, of course, the so-called Pseudo-Dionysius. And this is a very interesting connection. In his writings, like in the Celestial Hierarchy, Pseudo-Dionysius refers to his own teacher as someone called Hierotheos, right? And he also says that this Hierotheos supposedly wrote a text called The Elements of Theology, which is the title of a work by Proclus. So it's possible that Hierotheos was Proclus. This is a long story. I go through this in the video about Pseudo-Dionysius. But the important thing here is that he claims that his teacher was this figure called Hierotheos. And because Dionysius, in his text, he claims to be Dionysius the Areopagite, who is also a 1st century Athenian figure who was also converted and studied under Paul. And as we mentioned in that episode, scholars today and historians basically all agree that the writings of the so-called Pseudo-Dionysius was actually not written by the 1st century Dionysius the Areopagite, but by a writer much later, around the year 500 perhaps, who claimed to be Dionysius. But this also becomes really fascinating for the authorship or claimed authorship of the text that we're dealing with today. Because since this text claims to be a work by Hierotheos, it's a text that claims to be a text written by the teacher of Dionysius. So the question then becomes, is there actually any truth or authenticity to this claim? Well, there is a similarly scholarly consensus here in the sense that this text was most likely or almost certainly not written in the 1st century. Instead, it was probably written around the same time as the Dionysian corpus in the 5th or 6th century AD. Now the question becomes, did this text appear before the writings of Dionysius, thus in a way correctly being claimed as being the teacher of Dionysius in that sense, or is it rather a text that was written after Dionysius which claimed the name of the latter's teacher? So many will argue that this text, I think many scholars actually argue that this text was actually written after Dionysius, and its authorship claims to be by the teacher of Dionysius, probably also in a way of trying to become more authoritative, because by that point Dionysius had already been basically accepted in the church, so to say. There's no consensus as far as I understand, but I think the majority position seems to be, as I said, that the latter case is probably true, and that the text was thus written sometime in the 6th century. And even though I am certainly no expert on this particular topic or Syriac Christianity, I find this argument to be more convincing, since the text betrays some clear Dionysian influence, as we will see. The book technically doesn't have any title, at least not attached to the manuscript or the text itself, so to say. But the figure Theodosius Romanus, the head of the Syriac Orthodox Church in the 9th century, in a commentary on the work, called it of the Holy Hierotheos concerning the hidden mysteries of the house of God. And it is generally referred to simply as the Book of the Holy Hierotheos. So if it wasn't the Athenian Hierotheos that wrote it, who actually wrote the text then? Do we know anything about this? Well, we don't know for sure, but there have been some popular and compelling theories that have persisted since basically the time that it was composed. The most common attribution of this text is to a Syriac monk called Stephen bar Sudhayli, who lived between the late 5th to the early or mid 6th century. All we know about this character comes from outside sources, primarily those by Philoxenus of Mabug and Jacob of Serug, both of whom wrote very critically of Stephen, writing letters to him that were critical, accusing him of being a heretic, basically. In these texts, it becomes clear that Stephen was originally from Edessa, but had settled later in life in or around Jerusalem. Marsh retells some of the details like this, quote, "He had once for a short time been a follower of John the Egyptian, a heretic of whom nothing else is known. He was fond of drawing arguments or illustrations from scriptures, the plain meaning of which he failed to grasp. Although incapable of composition fit to appear in a book, he had written books, including a commentary on the Psalms, in which he claimed that he had received visions and revelations, and that he alone understood the true meaning of the scriptures." You can tell from the tone of these claims that Philoxenus was quite critical of Stephen. One account also cemented his status as a heretic to this particular biographer, as it is told that he had heard from some people that they had gone to visit Stephen's cell and found inscribed there on the wall the words, "Every species or nature or substance is consubstantial with the divine essence," to which everyone was horrified, including Philoxenus. And it is similar such controversial ideas and statements that also became attached to Stephen in these critical writings. We can once again quote Marsh's paraphrasing of these claims by Philoxenus that Stephen's writings contain these kinds of dangerous heretical ideas. He says, quote, "For in these writings Stephen had taught impious and foolish doctrines based on a misinterpretation of St. Paul's words that God may be all in all, had openly equated creation with God, and declared that it is possible for everything to become like him, that there will be no judgment, but everyone will arrive at the same measure of retribution, that demons as well as angelic hosts which did not fall are destined to become consubstantial with the divine essence, that all will arrive at one fulfillment, and as the limbs in the body which are consubstantial with each other and with it, so they, that is, all created beings, good and bad alike, shall be in God and with him in one single identity, in unification into one thing. And based on these sources, the claim that Stephen bar Sudhayli wrote the Book of the Holy Hierotheos is quite compelling, in my opinion, as well as in the opinion of Marsh and other scholars, because we find a lot of these ideas that he's claimed as teaching. We find very similar ideas in the Book of the Holy Hierotheos, especially in the fifth and last discourse, as we will see. And based on this, Marsh, who is the only one who has written an English translation and proper commentary and edition of this work in the modern world, argues that the case for Stephen having written the fifth discourse in particular is very strong, but the idea that he's written the rest of the text as well is also quite strong. Not as strong, but also maybe even probable that Stephen bar Sudhayli is the author, at least of the majority of this text. There is some disagreement, both historically and today. It's not like settled, but Stephen seems to be the most likely candidate. So enough context. What does the text actually say? Well, at its core, this is an example of what is known as ascent literature. At least the core section of the book describes the mystical ascent of the so-called mind on its path to purification and eventual union and commingling with the good, or supreme good, which is God. The text is divided into 5 discourses with several chapters in each discourse. And according to Frothingham and Marsh, the text can be divided into 3 parts. Discourse 1 deals with cosmology and explains the origins and state of the world. Discourses 2 through 4 is the meat of the text, right, which describes the dramatic and transformative ascent of the mind to unification. And lastly, the final 5th discourse, which is eschatological, describes the final end of things and presents some of the most radical teachings of the whole book. We'll get to this later. Throughout the whole book, the theme of esotericism is hammered home again and again. These teachings that Hierotheos gives his disciple, who is interpreted to be Dionysius himself, are holy secrets. He again and again says that none of this can be revealed to impure or regular minds, but is only meant for the pure and divine minds who have gone on this ascent journey themselves. This is such a recurring theme in this book, and one that is stated with such force that I kind of feel bad almost for making this episode and talking about it, because the author again and again is like, do not reveal what I'm going to say in this text under any circumstances to people who are not qualified to listen to it, which would be like the most pure minds who have ascended to unification, right? So I'm breaking this esoteric rule of this whole book just by making this episode. So sorry, Hierotheos or Stephen or whoever is talking here. But one might easily understand why he makes these claims too, because a lot of what is said in the text is certainly quite radical and striking, and we can very easily understand how Christians of that time would have maybe read it as at least controversial and at most outright heretical. In the very first discourse, we're introduced to the author's ideas about the origins of the world and the reason for the state of reality as it is. He introduces us to the idea that it is the mind that is going to be in focus here. It is the mind that is the part of ourselves that can ascend and commune with God. To borrow from a later discourse, the second one, the author says, "Know then that the body is the house of the soul, and the soul is the garment of the mind. For it is right that the soul should beautify its house, and the mind its dwelling place, for thus only can it enter into the heavens where Christ has already entered for our sake. But if anything of the archon be found in us, how then can we be accounted worthy to see the Father?" He praises the good, the supreme good, which is God, the one from which all things come, and to use biblical language, in which we live, move, and have our being. And in this praising of God, he already gives us a hint of what the end goal of this journey is going to be, in a radical statement of unification and perhaps monism. Quote, "With glorious praises, therefore, let us praise it, these praises which are possible only in a state of unification and before unification. But above unification, know, O my friend, that all distinction passes away, and where there is no distinction, who will glorify whom?" That which is not to be revealed will now be evident to thee, O my son, namely, that the act of glorifying is a proof of the existence of that which is other and distinct. But if that which is other has been divinely commingled and holily blended with its source, then otherness has been taken away, and the act of glorifying ceases. But if all things originate in the oneness of the good, why is the world as it is? The rest of the first discourse is indeed dedicated to talking about this state of affairs. God only wants to create that which is similar to God's self, so all distinction, that which separates us from God, must have its origins in something other than God. Quote, "The word concerning the good has shown that the good is in no wise consenting to make anything not the same. Else how could the good itself be the same, for diversity cannot be the work of sameness. Now, since the very designation of distinction is a proof to us of original sameness, and sameness does not cause distinction, we say that there must be something to cause distinction if distinction exists. Distinctions instead came about through the negligence of the essences that through that act became distinct from the absolute oneness of God. This distinction happens before the account in Genesis when God gives reality to all these essences and minds. And he does so out of pity, a compassionate act, quote, by means of which each fallen reasoning being is provided with an environment and a body corresponding to its degree of self-willed separation from God. Each thing in creation is given its appropriate level, given the degree of self-willed or self-caused separation from the oneness of God. Quote, for wisdom itself straightway arranged and ordered them, and set each essence in accordance with the measure of its affection, which gave to some of them a place in nearness to it and by its side, and some of them it set in an intermediate position, and some of them it cast to the outer regions. In this account and in the general cosmological discussions that are had in this first discourse in particular, this Pseudo-Hierotheos really kind of betrays a lot of the philosophical and theological influences that he has taken on and that are at work in this text. And it might be good to have a grasp of some of these inspirations and influences to fully appreciate what he is doing in this text. First of all, he is clearly influenced by Scripture, that is, the Bible, as the book is constantly referring to biblical verses and interprets them to provide grounds for its arguments. Secondly, the focus on the mind as the highest aspect of the self and of reality and the faculty by which we interact with the divine is probably a general inheritance from Neoplatonism, in which the idea of the nous is so central in a similar way. Now, this doesn't have to be a direct conscious transmission from the classical Neoplatonists, though, as these ideas had already been taken up and developed by other earlier Christian theologians. A prime example of this is, of course, the aforementioned Pseudo-Dionysius, who has a direct connection to this text, as we saw. Especially in the later parts of the discourse, when the author starts talking about the 9 ranks of angels, we can suspect a clear influence from the writings of Dionysius, especially in his celestial and ecclesiastical hierarchy, where he develops these exact ideas of these 9 ranks of angels, the triad within them, which is a clear reflection of the philosophical scheme of Proclus and his Neoplatonism. But probably the strongest and most obvious influence that the text is drawing from is the works of the 4th century Christian ascetic and philosopher Evagrius Ponticus. He was a famous monk who spent a lot of time in Egypt, like the Desert Fathers, as well as a prolific writer. His most famous work is what is sometimes called the Gnostic Trilogy, which consists of 3 works, Practicos, Gnosticos, and the Kephalia Gnostica. Now, these titles shouldn't confuse us into thinking that he was a Gnostic in the common sense of that word, but he rather uses the word Gnostic or Gnosis in the more general classic way. In fact, he's actively hostile to the so-called Gnostics of early Christianity. Someone he wasn't hostile to was the earlier Christian theologian of Egypt, Origen of Alexandria, as well as Clement of Alexandria. Indeed, Evagrius is often called an Origenist, and he adopted and further developed some of the classic and controversial teachings of Origen. Now, if you know your church history, you will know that Origen was condemned in the 6th century during what is often called the Origenist crisis, and his ideas are generally seen as suspect and sometimes even heretical. Thus, Evagrius, who had come to be one of the primary representatives of Origenism at that time, was also condemned post-mortemly. That is, at least in the Eastern Orthodox and Catholic/Western Church, because the so-called Oriental Orthodox churches had of course already split from the rest during the 5th century, so they didn't really care about the condemnations that happened later on. So Origen, and especially Evagrius, is still viewed as important teachers in these churches, perhaps especially in the Syriac church. The writings and ideas of Evagrius are really in the very DNA of the Syriac churches, which is one of the things that make them so unique. And of course, since the book of the Holy Hierotheos was written in Syriac and in a Syriac environment, this is significant. Because the book betrays very clear Evagrian influence, both in its cosmology, like we mentioned here about the origins of the world and the wide distinction come about from oneness. This is very clearly taken almost directly from Evagrius, but also in the whole general idea of the noetic ascent of the mind. This is very Evagrian. If you've read, for example, the Kephalia Gnostica, right, if you know that text and you read Hierotheos, you will see very clear influence. And speaking of which, it is in these 2nd to 4th discourses that we then find what is essentially the core of this text, as the author describes this ascent or purification of the mind from this world and the body, and on a long and almost psychedelic journey into the depths of reality, to angelic realms, interior, noetic spiritual versions of the stages of Jesus' life, and other biblical stories, and much else. Really, if you want to experience this yourself, you're going to have to just read the text, right? It's incredibly fascinating and engaging read, and I highly recommend you try to find a copy somehow. I'm not going to go through the whole text, obviously. I'm just going to give you a general overview, as well as give you sort of tools to be able to approach the text more easily. But if you actually want to experience it yourself, then you should just go read it yourself. This ascent journey that he describes is one of purification. Everything comes from the supreme good, and as we will see more clearly later, everything in some regard is the supreme good, but has only been obscured by negligence. This journey is one of stripping away and purifying the pure divine mind of these obscurities to become what it is at its deepest level. It is also an ascent of unification, as the author seems to indicate that as one reaches every new stage or part of this journey, what he refers to as mansions, one unites with that stage before moving on. So it's a kind of journey of increasing unification with new and higher levels of reality, everything becoming increasingly encompassed by this pure mind. He states in multiple places that for the natural scope of the knowledge of each one of the essences is limited to those which are below them. So, as one ascends on this journey, uniting with each new level or mansion, one encompasses them and thus can have a complete knowledge of them. The journey begins down here in our world and the body, where there are evil essences, demons and such things down here that will try to hinder this journey. But the mind must ascend beyond the body and the physical world, even the soul itself. The mind ascends to the firmament, where it meets the angels. And interestingly, it is the angels who worship him, because the mind is above the essences of the angels, as in that the pure mind is actually a higher reality than the particular essences or minds of the angels as angels. This ascended mind offers the angels communion. Then the author tells us that the mind has to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, but on an intellectual level by approaching the cross and becoming crucified. This ascent journey involves following Christ in a spiritual sense, and these parallels with the Passion story are very powerful and profound. The text says, "The cross, then, I say, is a kind of purifying and cleansing power, which through passion that causes passion brings passions to an end. Yet know that if there had been no fall, neither would there be passion, and if there were no passion, neither would there be the cross. For if the mind had preserved its essence, it would not have incurred the coming into this life, and where there is no coming, neither is there going. And so it has been made known to us that the cross is something necessary not to the essence of the mind, but to its purification. And 3 crosses are seen by divine minds, exactly what happened also to Christ, because man is of 3 essences and must be purified in all 3 of them. Because, since man is of three essences and must be purified in all three of them, it is right therefore for him that he should be purified by three crosses. We are crucified with three crosses, one for each part of ourselves: mind in the middle, soul, and body. All aspects of ourselves must die, go through the spiritual death to ascend further. The mind represents, in this analogy, Jesus, who is in the middle cross, and the two crosses next to it, which in the passion stories of the two thieves, is where the body and soul hangs. But just as Christ, the mind will then be buried and resurrected to a new, purer life, whereas the body and the soul will be left behind dead. Although he does also seem to indicate that the soul, or rather the mind, after resurrection, unites with the body and the soul again before it ascends, which is a little confusing. I didn't quite understand how that fits together, but this is one of the peculiarities of this text, I suppose. After being resurrected, the ascent continues even further and gets pretty strange. The mind encounters the tree of knowledge, which seems to be identified with the same tree from Genesis. This is a tree of evil, not to be eaten from. The mind is here given a sword by an angel in order to cut this tree down, but each time it does so, it just grows back up again. He realizes that it's a tree whose roots stretch down all the way to this physical world and even below the physical world. And in order to destroy it and move on, he has to reluctantly descend down all the way back again to this world and to the world below, where he battles with demons of the east, south, west, and north. The first two groups of demons are weak and are very easily beaten by the mind, but the last two groups are strong, and the mind is actually defeated by these demons. It is only because the mind of Christ comes down and saves it that it can move back up to the upper worlds and continue the journey. Then, in the next step of the ascent, is a very powerful moment when the mind encounters another of the events from the life of Christ, the baptism. The author clarifies that this is not a regular baptism of the body through water, but a spiritual or intellectual one through fire. Quote, "It is evident to us, therefore, O my son, that the baptism with water is the baptism of the body, and that it is only a symbol and a type of the glorious and real baptism, of which all divine minds are accounted worthy in the place that is above the heavens. Now the former baptism gives repentance, but that which is above unites us with the good." This baptism, just as for Jesus being a moment when his divine status is kind of confirmed in a way, becomes a transformative moment for the ascending mind. Here, indeed, it becomes united with Christ. It becomes Christ in a very real and profound way, not only united with, but identical to Christ. Quote, "It puts away the designation of mind and is called Christ. And when it ascends from that holy baptism, the whole glorious holy band of those who minister in that place is gathered together, and they come and worship before it, and now they say to it, 'Let all the angels of God worship thee.'" This is one of the most striking and profound parts of the text, as the author here indicates that Christ is only a step on the way to ultimate unification. And he indicates as much already in the first discourse when he says, "For if the Father is greater than the Son, and the Son is the guide of those who ascend, then the Son is only a mansion near the Father, and they who are going to the Father must pass beyond the mansion." And this also becomes obvious by the fact that the ascent continues beyond this point to an encounter with what he calls the universal essence. This is one of those points that I am the most confused about, but what it actually means. In some sense, this seems to designate God, the universal essence, as God, but earlier in the text he also seems to indicate that the universal essence comes about after the appearance of distinction, which would be like after, that would be somehow separated from God. Kind of similar to the nous in Neoplatonism, but I don't think that's exactly how he means it. So this is a part of the text that I don't fully grasp, I feel like. If we read the commentary of Theodosius on the text, he clarifies that the universal essence is called God. And by the universal essence, mysteries are revealed, since it is the source and maker of all things that are. And he also says, "And he calls God himself the universal essence, who is in truth the chief essence which is above description. And by it all was created in the beginning, and in it is its life, and in its mortality all things are." So we should probably understand it in this way somehow at least. This is the moment of encountering God, and perhaps even union with Him. At least God in the sense of God in relation to creation, the highest supreme essence or reality. He encounters this essence and is taught secrets from it, and then moves on to new mansions. Another way we might be able to conceptualize this is by considering the ideas of someone like Gregory of Nyssa, who talks about the experience of union with God to be an eternal one, not a static arriving, but a continued journeying in the infinity of God's essence. Similar things are also argued by mystics outside of the Christian tradition, such as the Islamic mystic Ibn Arabi, for whom the complete human, the insan al-kamil, is not someone that has reached some fixed static point of union with God, but rather one whose heart is in constant flux and capable of taking on all the constantly and infinitely changing manifestations of God. There could, of course, also be some very obvious Evagrian influence here that I'm not picking up on because I'm not that well read in Evagrius or the early Christian fathers, for example. There could be a lot of things going on here, but those are some of my ways of trying to conceptualize it. In any case, the mind next enters what is essentially described as paradise, where it goes looking for the tree of life to eat from its fruits. But surprisingly, the so-called opposite nature is still not completely defeated and tricks the mind by appearing as the tree of life, causing the mind to unite with this trickster. It is only once again because Christ comes and saves it, which is a little strange since mind was just claimed to be identical with Christ, and yet here Christ comes to save the mind from what is essentially like the devil who takes the form of this tree of life. If anyone has a good interpretation of how this works, then please leave it in a comment. Anyway, it then finds its way to the true tree of life and eats from it. Is this the final step on the path then? Not really, as there is a lot more to be done first. The mind once again receives a sword by the angels and is tasked with slaying the enemies of the Lord. He descends down to this world and below again, but this time almost ecstatically, since he does so, in a sense, as Christ. He is now able to slay all the demons and save the people that are being tormented by them. It descends further down, encountering the very roots of opposition, the so-called archon and the chief adversary, and slays it once and for all. After taking on the role of Christ, not only as a savior, but as the slayer of evil and judge of sinners, there is now a kind of transformation, which Frothingham, or Marsh, describes beautifully like this, quote, "Then at last it is sated with slaughter, and desires not to kill, but to give life, i.e., to cease to be son, and to become father. It hears the penitent cries of those in hell, and raises them to share in its ascent. It seems here to also take part in the very resurrection of the dead in a profound way. But then, in the lowest and darkest depths of the world, it finds a bright essence, the very same one that is experienced up there in the higher realms. This is, I presume, the universal essence that is referred to, and realizes that this essence is everywhere and pervades everything. Quote, and when it looks above, it sees itself above, and when it looks below, it sees itself below. Then it will be instructed in the glorious and holy mystery of the secret of the essence. Then it will cry out and say, if I go up to the heavens, thou art there. And if I go down to Sheol, thou art there also. And if I lift up the wings of my mind like an eagle's and dwell in the uttermost part of the sea, there also thy hand will hold me, and thy right hand will lead me. Whither then shall I go from thy spirit, and where shall I hide from before thee? For in heaven I have seen thee, and in Sheol I have found thee, and henceforth I shall know that heaven and earth are filled by thee. Then that mind will approach that essence, and will be united with it, and in it will become even as it is, and will see above and below, and the length and the breadth, and will contain in itself within that essence whatsoever is above and below. A very powerful section that hints at the inherent kind of monistic idea of this text, that at the core of reality, wherever we sort of look, from the highest levels of heaven to the lowest depths of Sheol or hell, everywhere is God's essence present, right? In the essence of the soul, in all things. And here the mind becomes united with that bright essence. And if it wasn't clear from the text already, this bright essence, which seems to be the same as the universal essence, is identified with God. Again, Theodosius clarifies even more in his commentary when he says, "The bright essence that is below is the mind which has shone with divine light above and below." He also says, "He gives the name the bright essence to God himself, who is above and below, and in all quarters there are in heaven and in earth. As he extends his light over all men, good and bad alike, so also he sheds it in all places, in dark places, and in light." Again, this is the clearest expression of the very monistic and maybe even pantheistic teachings that the book is known for, and which was one of the things that the possible author, Stephen bar Sudhayli, was accused of. It isn't, of course, a pure pantheism in the simple sense of that word, but clearly seems to indicate that the light of essence of God exists everywhere, as the most fundamental aspect and inner reality of the mind, or minds especially. As we mentioned before, this ascent is really only a purification. Since we all come from the One and are that One when distinction is taken away, this journey is really just one of purifying the mind of those things which obstruct it from the good and create distinction where there shouldn't be any. About the purifying soul, he says, "Neither is it possible to make fine gold if one purge not first away its dross, but the beauty that is in everything must be collected from the ugliness of everything. Since the beauty is concealed in the ugliness, and the good is bound up with the evil, and the greater the evil, the more purification it needs." He also says, "For the mind itself becomes to itself a burning fire, and through the glorious flame of its divine ardor refines wonderfully and holily the supreme good of the essence that is in it. And then that good nature begins to burst forth and highly and divinely appears as a glorious and flashing fiery fierceness." Here we see expressions and ideas that will become very common in certain mystical schools, including, of course, in places like Sufism. And this connection might not be as arbitrary as you might think, as we will see later. But with this unification comes the height of the ascent. The mind now even abandons the name of Christ, moving beyond even this distinction. How is this possible? Well, the very idea of Christ, or the Son, indicates a kind of relationship with the Father, a certain kind of duality. But we are now beyond any duality or distinction whatsoever. Quote, "For lo, the very name of Christ is assigned to us, as it were, of that which anoints and him who is anointed. For, of necessity, anointer and anointed were not one, but two. But if there is a stage when the mind will not be counted with the good as two, it is necessary for us, therefore, to abandon also the name of Christ." But things are even more radical than this. It isn't enough to abandon the name of Christ, but the mind even abandons the name of God, or Godhead. There is now a complete identity between the divine mind and the supreme good. And as he indicated in the beginning of the text, this is an identity that goes even beyond unification. Because unification indicates two things that become united, but at this stage, there are no two things, but only one. The author instead uses the word which Marsh translates as commingling, a pretty radical one. Quote, "For when the mind is commingled in the good, that distinction which it formerly possessed is no longer known or seen, and further, when there is in it but one, no longer are there counted with it two. For the time is appointed and destined to be, when the number two shall be no more, for it is evident that whatsoever is divided from one, but if division be removed, of necessity, all will become one." The mind has now become a reality which no longer glorifies, but is glorified. This is obviously very profound language, and you can see why this text has been somewhat controversial, but this is finally the end of the ascent of the mind. In a way, the mind is no more, but has disappeared into the reality of the supreme good, of God, in a complete commingling and identity. A truly breathtaking journey that the author has taken us on, one of surprising turns and twists, and with a profoundly striking ending. Hierotheos, or Pseudo-Hierotheos, clearly states that he has gone on this journey of commingling, and it is indicated that his student that he is talking to here, which might be Dionysius, also has gone on this journey. At least that he has come quite a long way on the journey. And once one has reached this state, one has knowledge of all things and can receive messages or even revelations, truths about reality not otherwise known. And it is one of these truths the author dedicates his last discourse to. And if you thought it was controversial so far, he has really saved the most radical stuff for the end here. He hammers down even harder on the fact that what he is about to reveal cannot, under any circumstances, be revealed to those who are not pure minds. Indeed, not even minds in unification are allowed to know this, but only those who have gone beyond union. There is no doubt that this will be considered heretical otherwise, he says. And what he presents in this last discourse, perhaps a bit disappointingly, is something that many of us have already encountered in other Christian writings, namely a version of what is called apokatastasis, or universal salvation, the idea that everyone will eventually be saved. Even the worst sinners in hell will get to come to paradise in union with God. This is an idea that was famously held by Origen and Evagrius, who seem to have been so influential on Hierotheos, Pseudo-Hierotheos, but also on more orthodox thinkers like Gregory of Nyssa. But there is something to be said for the incredibly radical way that the author expresses this idea, a fundamentally Neoplatonic one, that just as everything comes from the one, everything must eventually return to union with that one. And I mean everything. I'll just let the man himself speak. Quote, "Do thou then, my son, know that all things are destined to be commingled in the Father. Nothing perishes and nothing is destroyed. Nothing is annihilated. All returns, all is sanctified, all is made one, all is commingled, and the word is fulfilled which was said, God shall be all and in all. Hells shall pass, and torments shall be done away. Prisoners shall be released, for even reprobates are absolved, and outcasts return, and those that are far off are brought near. And chastisement ceases, my son, and the scourger scourges not, and the judge shall judge no more, and the officer shall not condemn, and the last farthing is given, and the prisoner who was bound is loosed, but he who has repented before the imprisonment has given the last farthing. For demons receive grace, and men receive mercy. And angels minister not, and seraphs consecrate no more, and thrones keep not their primacy, for the orders that are above pass away, and the distinctions that are below are abolished, and everything becomes one thing. For even God shall pass, and Christ shall be done away, and the Spirit shall no more be called the Spirit. For names pass away, and not essence. For if distinction pass, who will call whom? And who, on the other hand, will answer whom? For one neither names nor is named. This is the limit of all and the end of everything, and do thou take heed." Incredible stuff, right? I mean, the idea that hell is temporary and only a kind of purificatory state is a pretty common idea in like Eastern Orthodoxy, and I believe also in the Syriac Church, at least the Western, or is it the Eastern Syriac Church? I'm not entirely sure, but it's a relatively common idea in many Orthodox churches. But the way that he talks about even demons, supposedly, I would presume the devil too, everything will be saved. Everything will become one with God again, eventually, right? This is incredibly radical language in a way that we don't find in writers like Origen, right? And this is what makes it so radical, the way that he talks about it, and the scope of this mercy and this salvation, right? It's incredible. And that, in essence, is the book of the Holy Hierotheos. I did go through a lot more of the text here than I originally intended, but there is a lot more that I, of course, didn't get to, a lot of details, a lot of stuff that is impossible to really summarize. So I still highly recommend that you go read the text for yourself. It's a journey just to read it. The only version in English that is available is the one by Marsh, which was published a long time ago, like in the 1920s, I believe, and it's basically impossible to find. It's not printed anymore. It's a beautiful translation. It has the original Syriac in the back, which is always a plus for me. I think every translation of all text should have the original language in some way too, so I love that. And there's also a great introduction and commentary, beautiful introduction. And just a great translation too. So it's very sad that it's very hard to find. I was lucky enough to find a physical copy at the library in the University of Uppsala here in Sweden. So if you're quick enough, maybe you can get that one. If not, there is, luckily enough, a PDF version on archive.org. So if you don't mind reading digitally, which I kind of do, I'm one of those people that need a physical book unless I really have to. I prefer not to read digitally, but it is available in PDF form, so you can read it for free there as well. I highly recommend you check this book out. So now that you know what this book contains, how radical and strange and possibly controversial it is, it's pretty legitimate to ask the question, how is this book actually received? What's the legacy of this book? Did anyone actually read this? Well, as we said, it was written in Syriac, and it seems that it is particularly with the Syriac-speaking audience that it was known and read, naturally, right? But its relationship with these Syriac churches has been complicated. In general, it has been more popular and used in the West Syriac tradition, so the Syriac Orthodox Church, etc., than in the Eastern Syriac tradition, like the Church of the East, sometimes known as the Nestorian Church. But even here, it has a complicated and controversial reception history. It seems that in the immediate aftermath of its composition, probably around the 6th century, it was quite controversial as a book. We saw earlier that people like Philoxenus and Jacob of Serug condemned the figure Stephen bar Sudhayli as essentially heretical, and early on the book of the Holy Hierotheos did become associated with Stephen. So that meant that it too was an expression of Stephen's heresy and thus a dangerous book. But at the same time, as Marsh shows in his edition of the text, it also seems to have been in use quite diligently as a kind of mystic's guide for ascetic monks throughout the history of the West Syriac Church. And only 3 centuries later, in the 9th century, we see Theodosius, the Patriarch of Antioch and the head of the Syriac Orthodox Church, compose a commentary on the text in which he seems to praise it and consider it an important mystical text, and, importantly, a legitimate work of the historical Hierotheos. So at least at that point, in the 9th century, it seems that this text had become accepted, at least in parts of the Syriac Orthodox Church, because the head of this church praised it and wrote a commentary on it, and also accepted the claimed authorship. We included some quotes from that commentary of Theodosius earlier in the episode, if you remember, in our discussion. This status as a legitimate text is perhaps even further cemented by the fact that in the 13th century, the important figure known as Bar Hebraeus, one of the most influential and central polymaths and Mafrean, the highest authority below Patriarch, in the history of the Syriac Orthodox Church, he also wrote a commentary and abridged version of the text. It seems that Bar Hebraeus earlier in his career held the opinion that the text was written by Stephen bar Sudhayli and thus rejected it, but he seems to have changed his mind at some point and instead went on to accept the claimed authorship of Hierotheos and the mystical authority of the text, calling it a, quote, great and marvelous book. But he did also believe that the book had been corrupted and that certain parts had been added to it that weren't in the original. He assumed, of course, since he accepted that Hierotheos of the 1st century had written the text, that it was written in Greek originally, because Hierotheos was supposedly an Athenian, right? So he accepted the claim that the book was written in Greek and that it was the translator, the person who translated the text from Greek to Syriac, that had added some of these sections that were illegitimate or mistranslated certain parts. So because of this, Bar Hebraeus decided to rearrange the book. He removed certain chapters that he didn't think were legitimate and also rearranged some parts of the book to create a kind of abridged version of the text of his own. First of all, he seems to have removed all the parts of the mind descending back down to this world. You remember how he goes on this journey, and then on 2 occasions he has to descend back to this world to fight demons, etc. He seems to have removed those parts to make the ascent a more sort of straight ascent, and also because he considered some of those aspects to be astrology, which he didn't like, probably because it talked about, there's some sections in that descent journey talks about the sun and the moon and the directions, the demons of the west and east and north, etc., that he seemed to have found problematic in some way. But secondly, he also disagreed with the order of some of the chapters. Primarily, he noticed that the way the mind follows in the life of Christ, going through like crucifixion and baptism, was in the incorrect order, according to him. Because in this ascent of the mind, it starts with the crucifixion and burial and resurrection, and then comes the baptism, right? And then it ascends further. And he thought this was a mistake, that it should follow the chronology of the actual life of Christ, so that it starts with the baptism and then goes on to crucifixion, etc. Now this part of the book is clearly a kind of, or this part of his abridged, rearranged version is clearly a kind of flaw, because there is a reason why crucifixion has to come first, according to the logic and logic of the text that we have, right? Crucifixion happens first, where the mind has to die, and then it can become divinized through baptism. So there's a reason. So that part of his abridged version is kind of doesn't jive with the intention of the original text, probably. But there is something to be said, in my opinion, about the more straight ascent structure that he presents, because it is a bit jarring that we go to this point. He comes to the point of uniting possibly with the universal essence, and comes to the tree of life and eats of the tree of life, and then he goes down and fights the demons, and all these things happen, and then he finds the bright essence, and then he's united. It's a strange structure, and there's probably a reason for the structure. I don't doubt that there is a good reason for it, but as a reader, it's a bit strange. It's a bit hard to keep track of what's going on. So I get why Bar Hebraeus would want to make a more clear ascent structure. And it seems, in fact, that his abridged version became perhaps the most popular version of this text afterwards, at least for many centuries, up until recently, if not still. And I think this is probably why, because it is more accessible in that way, because it removes some of those stranger parts of the text. I don't actually know much about the status of this text in the modern Syriac Orthodox Church and the other Syriac churches. That I would love to sort of look further into that, do some research on that. But the fact that some of these the most authoritative figures in the history of the church commented on the text, accepted it, praised it, that sort of ensures that this text has been rather important, at least in some circles of Syriac-speaking Christianity throughout history. But there's also an enticing possibility that this influence extends even beyond Syriac Christianity and Christianity more generally. Indeed, one of the most fruitful areas of research when it comes to the emergence and early history of Islam is its interactions and connections with the Syriac Christians of the Middle East. Because indeed, when the Arabs conquered the Middle East and beyond, the Syriac Christians were the first people that they encountered. And so we find the earliest outside sources for the religion of Islam from some of these Syriac Christian writings. And they're very varied. Some of them are very hostile to the Muslims. Many others are quite friendly. The point is, in the very earliest days of Islam, there were very strong interactions and relationships with the Syriac Christians. Indeed, the majority of people living in the Islamic caliphates in the first couple of centuries, at least in the Middle Eastern region, were Syriac Christians. The Muslim didn't become majority population for a long time afterwards. So the Abbasid or Umayyad caliphates were a majority Syriac Christian speaking region in the Middle East. And this is significant. And when we talk about the emergence of Sufism, often referred to as Islamic mysticism, aside from its clear influence and origins in the Quranic revelation and Sunnah of the Prophet, it is also often pointed out that a quite likely source of influence were the ascetic practices of the Syriac-speaking Christians in the region. In fact, some of the earliest Sufis who seem to have developed important ideas for the tradition appear in these very areas, in and around Syria, for example, such as Abu Sulaiman al-Darani, Arabi al-Basri, the school of Baghdad, etc. We find, for example, in the writings of Isaac of Nineveh, or Isaac the Syrian, a very important Syriac-speaking Christian ascetic and writer and mystic, who lived right before and sort of very earliest days of the Islamic conquest. Mystical ideas that are very similar to some of the core Sufi ideas. So that could be an example of a kind of some direct influence or indirect influence from some of these Syriac-speaking Christians. This is a very interesting connection that deserves a lot more research. I'm usually quite skeptical of trying to compare and see like, oh, the Sufis were influenced by this or that. But if there's one place where I think those kinds of comparisons could be legitimate, it's probably these connections with the ascetic practices and ideas of the Syriac Christians. And some scholars indeed argue that the book of the Holy Hierotheos in particular might have been an important point of inspiration and influence. Many of the themes that would become so central in Sufism can be found in some form in the text, such as the idea of purifying the soul, or mind in this case, and the ascent to unification with God, which the Sufis would call fana, among other things. These might be surface-level comparisons of themes that can be found in many different traditions around the world, of course, and as I said, I'm usually quite careful about such comparisons, but in this case I am more open and curious than usual about the possible ways that there could be connections here, since we know that there were so strong interactions between Syriac-speaking Christians and early Muslims. These interactions continued throughout history as well, with these Syriac mystics and Sufis influencing each other. The above-mentioned Bar Hebraeus, for example, was deeply influenced by the Persian Islamic philosopher Ibn Sina, and his very important book of ethics, the Kitaba the Ethikon, was directly modeled after Abu Hamid al-Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin, the revival of the religious sciences, one of the most important works of Sufism and Islamic science in history. Needless to say, I look forward to seeing more scholarship and work being done on these intriguing connections. But even aside from these wider connections, the Book of the Holy Hierotheos remains an incredibly fascinating work in itself. The language that it uses and images that it paints on this ascent of the mind is quite unlike anything that I've ever read, and has to be one of the most interesting works of mysticism in history. Marsh writes about it that it cannot be denied that the Book of Hierotheos is one of the most amazing mystical books ever written by a Christian, and certainly the most interesting ever written in Syriac. No other Christian writer ever accepted so completely, or stated with such audacity, the pantheistic philosophy which is the logical basis of the theory of mysticism. Nowhere else do we find an account of the way that leads to unification so full of incident and of dramatic interest as the story of the ascent of the mind. And while one might want to nuance some of the ways that he talks about some of the words here, like mysticism and pantheism, I can't help but agree with the general sentiment. Again, if you want to read the book for yourself, which I recommend, you can find it in PDF form online on archive.org, or if you're lucky, maybe some local library has a physical copy of it. It's a book that I only recently found out about myself, so it is a book that is quite unknown to most people, even though it is such an incredibly fascinating one, and one that seems to be at the sort of crossroads of a lot that's happening in early Christianity, in Syriac Christianity, right before the arrival of Islam, and how that might have an influence. It's such an incredible text in many ways, and I think it deserves to be more known than it is. And I hope this episode has provided a bit more PR for this text and enticed you to look it up yourselves. Thank you so much for listening and watching. I would like to extend a special thank you as always to my patrons who keep this channel going. I would not be able to do any of this without the support of you guys, so I am eternally grateful. And I would also, of course, highly appreciate if more people wanted to become patrons so I can keep producing these videos, keep going on trips where I film on location, all these things that I'm so passionate about and that you allow me to do. So if anyone else wants to become a patron, I will leave links to that in the description and in a pinned comment. You can also leave a one-time donation if that's more your thing through PayPal, or simply support by commenting, subscribing, and leaving a like on this video. You can find me and my work more generally on my socials. It's on the screen. There's also a link tree in the description where you can find all my socials and all kinds of stuff that I'm up to. And you can also check out my other channel, Filip Holm, which is dedicated to my music, where I post my own music, I play music, my own music, I cover traditional songs, I talk about music in a similar way to the way I talk about religion here. So I think a lot of you would be probably interested in some of that content, so go check that out too. But again, thank you so much for listening today. I look forward to covering more Syriac Christianity. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to go through there. So I hopefully will be able to cover that some more in the near future. Until then, I'll see you next time.